Hello, welcome to the third episode of the DataSpot podcast. This is also the third and final part of our series on inflation. In the first episode, we talked about different inflation indices like CPI, WPI, the deflator, and inflation expectations. Last week, in the second episode, we talked about how CPI inflation is actually calculated in India. Hopefully, you now appreciate the enormous effort and diligence that goes into publishing the inflation number every single month. And in this episode, we will talk about how we can use the inflation data. One of the points we discussed in the last episode is that the key to measuring inflation is to compare prices for a common basket of goods and services. We compare the current prices of this basket with a reference period. Having a common basket is critical because that makes prices comparable. And the way NSO establishes a common basket of goods and services is through a detailed household expenditure survey that establishes the average consumption basket for all Indians. For calculating WPI, a similar approach is taken. A common basket of goods manufactured in India is established, and prices for that basket are compared across different points to know the average price change. What this means, though, is that if you are not the average consumer or the average producer, the inflation that you will experience will be different, at times very different from the inflation as measured by these indices. And as a rule, neither of us is an average consumer or the average producer. The goods or services an individual consumer or manufacturer will produce will be very different from the average consumption of all households or the average production of all manufacturers in the country. So, the inflation that we as individual household or business entity will experience will most of the times be not the same as the reported number. But this difference is also one of the ways the data can actually be useful. Now you will argue that if nobody actually experiences the inflation that the NSO reports, does this not invalidate the reported inflation data? And the answer is no. This does not invalidate the inflation data because this is just the nature of averages. When we say average daily rainfall in a particular month is say 50 millimeters, it does not mean that it will rain 50 millimeters every day of the month. There might be several days when it will not rain at all, and there might be several days when it rains much more than 50 millimeters. But the average gives us a sense of how much it rains in that month. It allows us to compare it with other months or other cities. In the same way, a car manufacturer which consumes steel will face different inflation from, say, a pharmaceutical company which consumes chemicals as inputs. So, it is quite natural that the inflation faced by both of them will be different. But this does not invalidate the average inflation that all manufacturers in the country face, which is the WPI inflation. That is not a quirk of data or an oddity, that is how it should be. Let us take a slight diversion here. You will find it interesting to note that not only do people experience different levels of inflation, they also perceive it differently. For example, we find that people above 60 years consistently perceive inflation to be higher than people in their 20s. Now, this could reflect their different consumption pattern or could reflect age specific behavioral traits. Because people in the 20s are generally likely to be more optimistic than people in their 60s. Now, let us get back to the main agenda of the episode. How does inflation number help us? What does it tell us? The most direct connection of the inflation number is with interest rates. And this connection has got even stronger since 2016 when RBI's mandate was changed to specifically keep inflation in check. The RBI is now legally mandated to keep inflation around 4% with a margin of error of plus or minus 2%. So, inflation remaining above 6% or below 2% for a long period of time constitutes a failure on the part of the RBI. And the standard way of changing the trajectory of inflation is through interest rates. If inflation is high or expected to become high, the RBI is likely to raise interest rates, and vice versa if inflation is very low. So, the overall inflation data is very important. It directly impacts our purchasing power and it has a second round impact to interest rates. For most people, though, the utility of the data stops here. But there is a lot more to the inflation data than just the headline data we read in newspapers or see on TV. The details or components of inflation data are equally and at times even more informative. This is because inflation data allows us to compare relative prices in the economy. How are prices of one category moving relative to others? And in a market economy, that is of a tremendous value. Let our in house economist Anisha explain this to us. Over to you, Anisha.
Thanks, Swapnil. Hey guys, I am born and brought up in Mumbai and thus have used the Mumbai trains quite extensively. And every once in a while, the trains would stop running either due to the tracks getting flooded in the rainy seasons or some technical issues like breakdown of train or the railway tracks having an issue. And when the trains would stop working, the auto rickshaw fares would go through the roof. The fares would become several times the regulated fares that have been set. This happens because there is a sudden increase in the demand for the auto rickshaws while their supply remains fixed because immediately on a given day, supply of auto rickshaw seats cannot change materially. So, it is quite logical that the price should increase. Now, this situation would quickly normalize as trains would start running once again the very next day in the most cases. But the price increase, even if it was just for a few hours, tell us that an imbalance between demand and supply had happened. Now, let us imagine that the trains remained out of service for not just a day or two, but for several days or weeks, or even months. What would one expect to see then? One would expect that the higher rickshaw fare should persist for much longer period as the mismatch between the demand and supply will continue for a longer period. But equally, we should see the higher fare result in more auto rickshaws plying on the road. People starting to use their own vehicles or doing the carpooling to travel to work. Some offices might even allow work from home. Basically, one would expect supply of auto rickshaws to increase and the demand for auto rickshaw seats to reduce and the fares to revert to the level prior to the disruption in supply. Now, let us assume that the rickshaw fares have only modestly reduced a month out, if at all. This is sufficient for us to conclude that the supply has not increased sufficiently or the demand has not reduced sufficiently. This could be because rickshaws are a regulated market and the government does not issue new permits. Or even if the government did issue new permits, but the rickshaw manufacturers were not able to manufacture more rickshaws, or because the ownership of private vehicles is very low. Basically, elevated prices allow us to conclude that the market remained disrupted and did not evolve the ways laws of economics would have made us believe. The point of this example is that prices, both their level and direction, tell us a lot more about the state of the market, be it a rickshaw fare or a hotel rent or even mobile phones. And we saw this during the pandemic. When the pandemic initially hit us, prices of face masks and sanitizers rose sharply as demand rose sharply and the supply could not rise immediately. But over a period of time, companies that used to make shampoos and soaps also started making sanitizers and masks and their prices have fallen by over 30 to 40%. This price movement, for example, tells us that A. Demand rose sharply initially, B. Supply gradually caught up and thus prices have reduced sharply. It also tells us that it is relatively easy for businesses to start producing sanitizers. There are no great entry barriers, technical, financial, or regulatory, to production. Thus, in a free market economy, price information for a commodity or group of commodities is very valuable and provides a lot of insights. And the various components of inflation data are one of the best sources for price data since it is available at very granular level as well as a high frequency. With this, it is back to Swapnil.
Thanks, Anisha, for this lovely example. Now I'm going to look at the CPI data in a different way and see where the prices have risen sharply in the last few years and what was driving that. For investors and analysts, there is other use of inflation data. Let us talk about that, which is relative price movements. Let us say you are researching the automobile sector and you know that steel is a key input of the sector. Now, the relative price movements of the two will be a guide for the profitability of the sector. For example, if historically, when steel prices have increased, automobile companies have not been able to increase their prices commensurately. So you can judge that their profitability might suffer temporarily, and vice versa when steel prices have fallen. So, next time you expect steel prices to increase, you will have a rough sense of what this might do to the profitability of automobile companies. And this analysis can be done across any sector. Take another example. Wheat, vegetable oils, or sugar are inputs for packaged food companies. Comparing prices of these raw materials to prices of final packaged product can also be a good indicator of the profitability of these companies. Similarly, the relative prices of agricultural products and non agricultural products tell us how incomes and expenditures for people in rural India might be trending. An inflation number is not just any random number. It tells us a story of everyone, be it an auto dealer, a kirana shop, a homemaker, a matchbox factory, or even a software company. If you trickle down on how a particular entity gets its raw materials and sells them across the market, or how a family earns income and spends it on their livelihood, you can see different inflation stories that are beyond numbers. Numbers will only make sense, or put differently, one can understand the depth of these numbers only if we understand the flow of transactions and stories behind them. That's it from this episode. Next up is the inflation's best companion, which is interest rate. We will discuss how interest rates and inflation are interrelated and how RBI's monetary policy changes your home loan rates in the next episode. See you soon.
And that concludes this episode. I hope you liked it. Your hosts today were Swapnil and Anisha. The transcript of this episode and episode links are available on our website indiadatahub.com. If you did like this episode, please subscribe and share this with others who you think might be interested. If you have any feedback or suggestions as to what topics we should cover, do drop us a line at podcast@indiadatahub.com. See you next week. This is Ashutosh, the co-founder of India Data Hub, signing out.